Hello? Hello? Hello?
Ma'am, Sheila ma'am, you're audible. You're audible, ma'am.
Good morning, ma.
Good morning,
கேக்குதுல்ல
ma'am.
நான் சொல்றது? Good morning, ma.
குட் மார்னிங் மேம், கேக்குது மேம்.
சரிங்கம்மா, தேங்க்யூ.
Sheila ma'am.
Hello?
Good morning ma'am.
Sumati?
Am I audible ma'am?
Audible. Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Sheila ma'am, has sir joined ma'am? Has sir joined ma'am?
I don't think so, Patricia. You have his number, no? Patricia?
Ma'am, yes ma'am.
Patricia?
Yes ma'am. Ma'am, yes ma'am.
Patricia?
Yes ma'am, yes ma'am.
You have his number, no?
Yes ma'am, I'm just calling him ma'am.
Ah,
I'm calling him. I'll just get back to you ma'am. I'm calling him.
okay, ma'am.
Hello. Good morning, sir. Sir, this is Natasha from St.Mary's College, sir. Yes, sir. Thank you. Sheila ma'am, sir will be joining us shortly,
Okay.
ma'am. I spoke to him, he'll be joining
Okay,
us shortly,
Mata.
ma'am.
Okay, Patricia.
Yes, ma'am.
செல்வி ரெடியா இரு. செல்வி இங்க வா.
எனக்கு வரல, நான் வரவே இல்லை ஆன்லைன் கிளாஸ்.
Participants, kindly note, please don't start presenting in between. I repeat, participants, kindly note, please stop presenting. I can see few people trying to present your screen, so I kindly request you all to stop presenting your screens. Mr. Meher, I think I can find your screen being presented. Kindly stop your presenting there. Hello? Hello? You've joined, sir. Okay, sir. Thank you, sir. Participants, kindly note, I kindly request you all to stop presenting your screens. Sheila ma'am? Ma'am, sir is
Patricia.
joined, ma'am. Sir is in the group.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, it's 11:02. Shall we begin, ma'am?
Okay, begin. Let's
Because we
begin,
have
Patricia.
crossed the limit, ma'am. We are already 250 there. So the rest will be
Okay,
joining
okay.
in the YouTube only, ma'am. So we shall begin,
Okay,
ma'am.
Patricia. We shall begin.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Sumati, ma'am.
Sheila ma'am.
Mm.
Sheila ma'am.
Start. Sumadi, you start.
Shall I start?
Yeah. Begin.
A very pleasant and divine morning to everyone. I am Sumati, Assistant Professor of English, St.Mary's College. On behalf of the PG and the Research Department of English, I welcome you all to this webinar. COVID-19 has affected the world at large, but this has also given us glimpses of the good that exists in the world. This global pandemic has accelerated the need for enterprises to prune our expertise. We have got ample time during this lockdown. The sun's rays do not burn until brought to a focus. Let us focus ourselves on the intellectual path. Thank you, participants, for joining us for the webinar on pandemic discourse and literary responses. Today, we are very fortunate to have Dr. T.Marx, Professor, Department of English, School of Humanities, Pondicherry University, Pondicherry as our resource person. Now, I'd like to call upon Mrs. A. Judith Sheila Damayanti, Head and Associate Professor, Department of English, to deliver the welcome address. Over to you, ma'am.
Very good morning to all. The human tryst with epidemics is as old as the hills. At this star-studded moment, I am much delighted to welcome Reverend Sister Secretary Flora Mary, the nerve center of the educational hub, St. Mary's College Autonomous, Thuthukudi. I wholeheartedly welcome our principal, Reverend Dr. Sister A.S. de Lucia Rose, the life and breath of this landmark institution. A high-profile icon as she is in a virtual world where technology dominates our every nerve, our principal has indeed brought in a paradigm shift in our academic endeavors. I heartily welcome our principal, Dr. Shivana, vice principal, Dr. Shivana, a dynamic and vibrant personality. It's my pleasure to welcome and introduce Dr. T.Marx, Professor, Department of English, School of Humanities, Pondicherry University, Pondicherry. Dr. T.Marx is a renowned and widely known speaker who needs no introduction. He has a covetous academic profile which speaks volumes of his intellectual caliber. He has 18 long years of illustrious academic career. His area of specialization is drama, comparative literature, and subaltern studies. He has 9 years of meritorious research guidance. He has, to his credit, published 15 books in English and 2 in Tamil. His research publications adorn reputed national and international journals. He has earned the reputation of holding responsible positions in premier institutions. To name a few, he has served as the member of the panel for confidential work at the UPSC New Delhi, has been the member of the panel for the award of Bal Sahitya Puraskar 2012, has been the member of the selection committee of Indira Gandhi Arts and Science, has been member of the board of studies of leading universities. He has also served as the member of the evaluation panel for PhD in the University of Hyderabad. Awards and accolades crown his literary career. In short, he remains a colossus in the literary arena. Indeed, we have the most befitting person in our midst to address us on the topic pandemic discourse and literary responses. On behalf of the PG and Research Department of English, I heartily welcome all the participants and my dear colleagues to this national webinar. Welcome one and all.
Thank you, ma'am, for your warm words of welcome. Dear professors and scholars, kindly mute your mics and videos when the session is Dr.T.Marx to share his valuable ideas on pandemic discourse
Ma'am?
and literary responses.
Ma'am?
Over to you,
Okay,
sir.
மெயிலா எந்த மெயில் மேம்? ஹலோ
Am I audible?
மெயில் பேஜா?
Yes, sir. Audible.
Yeah.
ஓகே தானே மேம்? ஓகே மேம்.
Thank you so much for the nice words.
இல்லை மேம், என்னன்னா நம்ம கூகுள் மீட்டை விட்டுட்டு மற்ற அந்த பக்கத்தில் இருக்கிற ஸ்லைடு தொட்டா
Friends, a
அதுதான்
very good
போகுது.
morning to you all.
அங்கே ஓகே தானே மேம்? ஒன்றும் ப்ராப்ளம்
Yes,
இல்லைல்ல?
sir.
We all
Good morning, sir.
Good morning, sir.
Sir? Excuse me, sir. I think you have muted your mic, sir.
Am I audible?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Audible.
Yeah. So, Sister Flora Mary, the Secretary of St. Mary's College, Sister Lucia Rose, the Principal of St. Mary's College, the convener of the webinar, Ms. Judith, dear participants, learned colleagues, a very good morning to you all, and I'm very happy that I'm part of this webinar today. Thanks to the COVID-19 lockdown situation, the pandemic situation, which has compelled us to be indoors and to share our own little bit of knowledge with our friends, academic fraternity. So in that way, I thank St. Mary's College, which has arranged for this webinar during this pandemic lockdown period. The topic of today's discussion is pandemic discourse, literary responses. Because I have two phrases in the title, pandemic discourse, first, and the literary responses, the second. Naturally, it should be the second because it's only a response to the
Sir,
dear admin, I am not muting my microphone.
okay, sir.
From your side, somebody is muting me. Please unmute.
Okay, sir. Thank you. So you need to
Yes,
unmute yourself, sir. We will not be able to unmute you, sir. I'll check that nobody mutes you here, sir.
I have unmuted myself. Now I am audible.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Yeah, please don't mute me again.
Yes, sir. Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
Yes. Please take care of that.
Yes, sir.
So I have two phrases in my title: the pandemic discourse, the first, and the literary responses, the second. I would like to throw more light on the pandemic discourse first, and the literary responses secondly, because it should be naturally the second part of a title, because it's only a response to the first, the pandemic discourse. So as you all know, the world is in a crisis, in a critical situation. All of us are grappling with many unanswered questions, The uncertainty puts all of us in a state of paralysis, I would say. We all reached a kind of situation where, we all suffer from a kind of solitary syndrome. And when I was teaching my students the theater of the absurd, where everybody was talking about, especially Samuel Beckett was summarizing the whole tendency of the post-war Europe in a statement that we all wake up only to sleep again, which sums up the whole mood, the sentiments, the mood, the tendency of the post-war European society. We now, students who could not understand or comprehensively understand the sense of the nonsense, right? The sense, making sense from the nonsense, or the so-called irrational, absurd movements. Now, perhaps with the lockdown period, with the lockdown experience, with the pandemic situation, all of us can understand seriously what would have been the tendency, what would have been the mood of the post-war European society, and how people would have experienced the solitary syndrome, the anxiety, the ennui, all these things. So the world the whole world is in a crisis now, and we are all, as the subjects of the world, we are all grappling with many unanswered questions. And the level of uncertainty is growing day in and day out. So the pandemic, etymologically, you have the pandemic, which means when you try for an etymological hunt for the word pandemic, it simply takes us back to the European languages, right? Like Italian, the French, and the Spanish, which means communicable diseases, right? It spreads from one to the other, and it is transmittable. The French and the Italian root words convey as the meaning for the word pandemic as transmit, whereas the Spanish root word contagiosio, right? This contagiosio was referring to the contagion, the contagious nature of the pandemic today. So it is either transmittable or contagious, and these terms are of European origin. And not only the terms are of European origin, the understanding of these diseases are also of European origin. In earlier times, the classical societies believed that contagious diseases can be controlled only by alienating oneself from. Sorry, dear admin, some noise is coming from your side. Please unmute everybody else.
Is it okay now, sir?
No, I think there is still noise from your side. Please unmute everybody. So not only the terms are of European origin, the very understanding, our own understanding, or a layman's understanding of pandemic is also European. Our own understanding of the disease is also European. In earlier times, the classical societies believed that contagious diseases can be controlled only by alienating oneself from the rest of the system. This is my first point. So the very discourse, the very word pandemic, or the very context pandemic, or meanings that are associated with the word pandemic, or the meanings that you derive or we derive out of pandemic, all these terms are related terms, like social distancing. All these terms are of European origin. So the very understanding of these diseases are also European, and we simply follow the Western model. We simply follow the European model, and we just follow the European understanding of these pandemic diseases. This is my first point. And in such times, in such critical times, classical societies believed, the European societies believed, the medieval societies believed that contagious diseases can be controlled, can be contained only by alienating people from the rest of the system, alienating people from others, alienating one from the other, even within the family. So social distancing is a politically correct word in the European context, and even in the context of COVID-19. Historically, social distancing, not social gap, right? I just want to distinguish between these two. The social distancing, but not social gap, is the only way out according to the European epistemology, the clinical epistemology of Europe. So our own belief that quarantine all of us are very, very familiar with the word quarantine. Even a layman is very much familiar with the word quarantine now after the COVID-19 lockdown period. So our own belief that quarantine would protect us, right, would protect us is beyond medical knowledge. The strategies followed by governments across the world, the social behavior of people are not completely medical oriented, but socially and culturally conditioned. This is my second important point. The strategies followed by all the governments, not only the governments the European governments, but also governments across the world, right? Governments of the East, governments of the West, government of India, government inside, all governments, all state governments inside India, and the social behavior of people are not completely medical oriented or supported by medical proof or evidence, but socially and culturally conditioned. So the views that wearing a mask will prevent us from COVID-19, social distancing will protect us from COVID-19, lockdown will protect us, or it will either at least restrict the rapid spread of this pandemic. All these things are not completely medical oriented, but socially and culturally conditioned as well. So we all tend to believe, and of course made to believe, that the pandemic diseases are visiting us like ghosts or uninvited guests from a far distant space. We never ever believe, or we are not ready to believe, that the disease it's part of us, or it evolved from us, or it emerged from us. It's not our disease. That is what we always say. It's not our disease. It's not a product of our own mistakes, both in terms of lifestyle changes and changes in the healing methods, our own traditional healing methods. We are not ready to accept that it is our disease, or it is a product of our own lacunas, our own mistakes, both in terms of lifestyle changes and healing methodologies. We all tend to believe, and the states have made us to believe, that the pandemic diseases are visiting us like ghosts or uninvited guests from a far distant, from an alien space, from outside, to put it in simple terms, from outside. And now there is a saying, there is a complaint, there is a grievance, or there is an open charge against China that this specific COVID-19 has been sent by China to destabilize all the nations, especially the superpowers of the West, which is a myth. So this specific tendency to believe that it comes like a ghost, because we have absolutely no idea about the pandemic. We don't know who brings it. We don't know who is the carrier of that corona virus. We don't know from where it comes and how it spreads. Somehow, we need to believe a kind of perceived idea about corona, especially with the inputs from media, newspapers, and other things. So it's not a product of our no nation that is fighting, right, to claim ownership over geographical territories is ready to claim the source of the disease. That is my third important point. I repeat this point. No nation that is fighting to claim ownership over geographical territories is ready to claim the source of the disease. Any disease for that matter, not necessarily the present COVID-19. So the, very good example you can find in Albert Camus' The Plague. where there is a positivity in the whole narration, the whole narrative of Albert Camus. When people are not ready to claim, or when people are not ready to accept that the disease is theirs, Camus has shown the plague, at least Camus has shown the plague as emanating from the city of Oran. That is the greatness of Camus-like literary agent. So Europeans were using the umbrella term plague to refer to all forms of communicable diseases. One can find a lot of historical notes from the European myths, literatures, rituals, and songs, just like the inexplicable link between Mariamma and smallpox of Tamil Nadu. We have a country deity, we have a rustic deity called Mariamma. Mari in Tamil means, rains, Malay. So smallpox used to spread only in terrible summers, in scorching heat. And when rain comes, it will subside. That's with that belief, people created deities to protect them from the smallpox, from chickenpox, right? And they created a deity called Mariamma. So they worshipped rain in the form of a lady deity, goddess, Mariamma. So just like this specific inexplicable link between Mariamma and smallpox, you have a lot of references in the Bible as well. Christianity has hundreds of references in the Bible, especially when it talks about the relationship between God and the sufferings of people under plague. So in a society when injustices are increasing, a plague strikes humanity. This is the belief that all religious systems propagated in the minds of people. So it is an ethical explosion according to the religious people. Right? They believe that it is an ethical explosion, which has taken the form of a plague, which has taken the form of COVID-19 or any other pandemic disease for that matter. So many people believe that the Black Death was a kind of divine punishment for human sins. So the flagellants, I give you a very small example of when there was Black Death across Europe. When the Black Death struck and killed or cleansed a huge mass of human population, the flagellants, the extreme form of or an extreme sect of Christianity, the flagellants that traveled from town to town, and they engaged in public displays of penance and punishment, and they were beating themselves in public places with a whip, and they were indulging in a kind of self-punishment, self-torture, as a kind of penance for the sins of humanity, thereby protecting humanity from the divine punishment. So this way, the religious perspective of the pandemic discourse was also available throughout European literatures and also in the Oriental discourses. So narrated as nature's punishment for human excesses. Sometimes, people believe that the pandemic, when we don't understand the very nature of a pandemic, when we don't know from where it comes and how it affects and when will it go. Now you ask anybody, when will corona disappear, when will it disappear, nobody knows, including the scientists, the states. And we are absolutely left in a flux, left in a kind of vacuum, right? And we are made to believe all kinds of things. So it is sometimes people believe that and the pandemic diseases were narrated as nature's punishment for human excesses. So regarding this pandemic, we have records from the 1st century onwards. The European scientists and priests believed that initially they believed that it was airborne. What we call the miasmic nature of pandemic diseases. It spreads through air. So when human beings
Sir, excuse me, sir. Sir, your mic is muted, sir.
Madam, please take care of this.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Please mute your thing also, because it creates a lot of noise.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes.
So, for example, when we fell down trees in a forest, or when we hunt animals, when human beings intrude into the wildlife and into the forest, the germs and virus where the trees and animals were forced for the germs and virus, right? It will explode and pass on to humans. When you vacate the germs and virus from its inherent with its inbuilt host, from its inherent and inbuilt host, right? And it will move on to human population. Even today, when you watch certain movies, be it Hollywood or Bollywood or Hollywood movies, suddenly, in some thriller movies, you will find the sky getting dark abruptly and a pestilent wind blowing people dead. These things are signs of human intervention into the wildlife and nature's punishment for human excesses. A very good example with regard to this specific perception of the pandemic is Oedipus Rex by Sophocles. It's a long history. In Oedipus, if you read Oedipus Rex in today's COVID-19 situation, you can find a lot of parallels. Of course, I cannot draw an analogy between Oedipus Rex, the ruler, who calls himself I Oedipus, whom all men call the Great. This is how all the rulers of the world today, all the presidents, prime ministers, the bureaucrats, even a police constable, right? All these power people who exercise power upon the innocent human population, they all speak in the same kind of autocratic tone. And when Oedipus Rex says, right, I will solve this crisis, as an individual, he tries his level best by sending his brother-in-law Creon to the Pythian temple to get some kind of prophecy. And the prophecy says he is responsible for it. And the play also discusses ways in which the miasmic disorder is very much leveled in the city of Thebes. So there was an analogy between the city of Thebes and the city of Athens, which was very much hit by the Black Death. So this specific and Oedipus Rex is answering the riddle of the Sphinx is another important thing. Literary scholars, literature students should keep in their mind. It is a Sphinx which is a hybrid product, which is a mixture of a woman and the lion, which says that when he destroys the Sphinx, and when he answers, he destroys the disease as well. And there is, when you trace the history of all kinds of pandemics, people find out that the virus emanates from the animals to human population. So this specific analogy can be traced throughout Oedipus Rex, the text. Such a wonderful text, if a vigilant reader, if an anxious reader reads Oedipus Rex in today's context, Oedipus Rex, I'm sure, will provide you. The reader will reap a golden harvest from Oedipus Rex, the text. So it's a long history. If you trace the history of eradication methods or vaccination for these diseases, or the healing methods for these diseases, it takes us back to 2,000 years back. So beyond the medical scientific understanding, we have ethnic, political, religious, psychological factors, right, that are rooted in the European public memory. Medical historians, medical anthropologists have clearly recorded that the aliens were forbidden. Sealing of borders. Today, a person from one district could not enter another district. District borders are sealed. State borders are sealed. And earlier, during the pandemic, during the pandemic spread, national borders were sealed. The first loss of, this is my next important point, the first loss of sealing the borders, the first loss of quarantine is the loss of empathy and concern for fellow human beings. And we all have witnessed the high exodus of migrant laborers from South India to North India, from North India to South India, from one state to the other, from one district to the other district, from the urban landscapes to the rural villages. And so you found a huge exodus of migrant laborers, jobless people who lost their jobs. People, even I read in a newspaper that even engineering, self-financing engineering college teachers are left jobless today. So all of them could not pay their rent for a period of 3 months, 4 months, and they went back to their villages. So this kind of an exodus from the urban landscape to the rural, all these things point towards a specific thing, that the first loss, because of this quarantine or lockdown or sealing of borders, is the loss of empathy and concern for our own brothers and sisters. So in earlier times, ships were stopped because they traced the spread of the disease to the travel routes. So ships were stopped in the mid-sea, and the crew in the ship were not allowed to reach the shore. They were left isolated in the mid-sea, and European public memory preferred and justified this specific lockdown measure. And all over the world, the governments exercise unlimited powers. And this is my next point, which I would like to throw more focus on. All over the world, the governments, the states, started exercising unlimited powers upon the innocent people, the unsuspecting people. So history, the unsuspecting subjects. So the history of pandemic is the history of the rise of fascism. The history of pandemic is the history of the rise of autocracy.
Excuse me, sir. Sir, your mic is muted, sir. I kindly request the participants not to mute the speaker. Google Meet does not provide option to mute everybody. So I kindly request you all to maintain discipline and decorum in the forum. Kindly don't mute the speaker.
So I repeat the statement. The history of pandemic is the history of the rise of fascism. And the history of pandemic is the history of the rise of autocratic forces, the rise of Chauvinism, the rise of despotism, the rise of dictatorship. So with the vaccine and clear therapeutic protocols seem quite far away, right? There is no scope at all. When will the vaccine be produced? No idea. When will you create a kind of therapeutic protocols? It seems very quite far away. So with these ambiguous biomedical guidance and government inaction, we are left very much isolated and orphaned, I would say. I would even say we are left to protect ourselves. All human beings today in this COVID-19 situation are left to take care of ourselves. So we cannot expect anything from anybody else, whether it is individuals or a kind of organized setup, the institutions, be it the government or the states or any form of institution for that matter. So the human tendency to divide the society into us and others, it is a product of this kind of a pandemic discourse. So when we call us the normal, right? The normal, and when we call them the others, they are all patients. So when fear strikes us, right? When the pandemic fear strikes us, and that fear strikes becomes especially prevalent during infectious disease epidemics, and leads people to physically distance themselves from perceived sources of transmission. All our sources of transmission, because I start suspecting my own neighbor, I start suspecting my own family members, I start suspecting my next door neighbor, I start suspecting my relatives, my own villagers. So all kinds of sources of transmission are perceived sources of transmission, only suspected sources of transmission. And this suspected sources of transmission, with that specific or from these perceived sources of transmission, we are trying to, or we are led by the states to physically distance ourselves. So an older person, right, there is a myth surrounding this specific pandemic discourse that older people belong to the risk group, which it creates a very false sense of security for people who are not old, right? And now with every day's news coming in, we learned that even youngsters, right, even small kids, small children, teenagers, youngsters are becoming victims of this pandemic discourse. So the myth that only old people belong to the risk groups or only old people cannot survive if they are afflicted with this pandemic is a myth. So the stigma attached to the disease is the greatest problem that our society encounters today. The social inequality intensified the vulnerability of poor and marginal groups, because we justify the state or the perceived opinion, the perceived ideas, right, justify the death of the old and the weak people. So I would like to borrow certain things from Foucault's concept of the biopower and biopolitics. Foucault rightly says biopower is structured by the alternative between making somebody live and letting somebody die. This specific choice of protecting people and leaving them die is in the hands of the state now. So the state decides who should be protected and who should be left just like that. See, more than 17, 18 migrant laborers were killed on the railway tracks. And day in and day out, we read the suicides committed by jobless labor. So this specific thing, and when this pandemic disease strike the poor and the marginalized, they are totally dependent on the state's medical service system. So this specific the decision to protect people or leaving them just like that is totally it rests with the power, it rests with the state, it rests with the authority. So older, you would have come across a very marked news brief which was very much shocking when the Lieutenant Governor of Texas, Mr. Dan Patrick, openly said older people would rather die than let COVID-19 harm the US economy. Don't sacrifice the country. Don't do that. Dan Patrick said this. Don't sacrifice the country. Let people die. Let old people die. And he added, right, fearing the public health restrictions to prevent coronavirus, right? He knows it and he is willingly to risk death to protect the economy for his grandchildren. He justified it, saying that I am ready to sacrifice my own life. I am ready to sacrifice my own life for the future of my grandchildren. I won't let the American economy die. Instead, rather, let the old people die. So corona won't spread in, and this kind of government's decision, this government's power to protect, or whom to be protected, who has to be protected and who has to be left orphaned, left abandoned, is in the hands of the governments and the states. This is where the greatest disaster, worse than the pandemic disaster, lies. So corona, another important myth is corona won't spread in India in this hot temperature. Now we all see it is spreading very rapidly only in very terribly hot conditions and situations, climate conditions. It is decided these myths are based not purely on medical grounds but only politically. Even when there is a shift from the miasma-oriented pandemic discourse to the virus-oriented pandemic discourse, there is no change in the authority of the states and their surveillance mechanism. So with the advent of in the earlier times also, during the Black Death, right, in the first phase, second phase, and the third wave of the pandemic, of the Black Death, of the plague, the states exercised enormous power over people. And even today, the same thing is getting repeated. So with the advent of the virus in 1850, especially with Louis Pasteur, the invention of antibody, instead of allaying the fears of common people, it rather strengthened the fears of common people. People started developing more and more fears. They started sacrificing their rights for the very survival. You can notice who supports the lockdown. If I ask you the question, do you support the lockdown? All our academic brothers and sisters will say yes. Lockdown should be made very much strict. The government should enforce it very, very strictly, and nobody should roam free. People are very much callous. People are very much complacent. People are least bothered about the disease. People don't know. This is a kind of elite statement that comes from our own brothers and sisters, from all of us, that people who roam free, they don't know the seriousness. They don't know the seriousness of the pandemic, this kind of a pandemic disease. They don't know what COVID-19 is. They don't know the impact of it. See, the very problem with a person, a layman, not understanding the intensity of this kind of a pandemic disease, again, is a problem of the state propagating the intensity of the disease. So instead of allaying the fears and boosting confidence in people, the government is trying to intimidate people every day, every minute, every second, and people started developing more and more fears about the pandemic. So they started sacrificing their rights for the very survival. You can notice the rich people, the middle class especially, supporting the lockdown, because poor people have nothing to lose. They don't take COVID-19 seriously because there is a sense of acceptance, right? If something comes and if pandemic hits a village, they accept it, and death is also very much casually accepted in a rustic atmosphere. Unlike in urban spaces, the fear of death is very much haunting the urban landscape more and more than the rustic landscape. So the culture of accepting death, the culture of accommodating people, or adjusting, acclimatizing themselves to a new kind of disease, or preparing themselves, the preparedness of the rural situation, the rural spaces, right? That specific thing is completely missing in the urban landscapes, including the government's, urban spaces, landscapes. So the middle class, the rich, the people who are in favor of accumulation of power by the state, even people who speak human rights and democratic values succumb to the fears generated by the pandemic. And as a result of this fear that is generated by the pandemic, people are willing to pawn their life for security. They are ready to lose anything. They are ready to undergo any kind of suffering. They are ready to sit inside their homes for any number of months, for any number of months, for any number of days, for any longer time, but their life should be protected. So these fears determine the socio-political values. When your existence is at stake, the democratic values are thrown overboard, and states emerge as an unassailable power center. Another subsidiary characteristic of biopolitics is the erasure of rituals and habits of common people. Now we don't check whether we have picked up our wallet, whether we have taken our helmet, whether we have taken the key of our office. We don't check all these things. Rather, we are very consciously checking whether we are wearing a mask or not. You can leave your house and go elsewhere even without a penny, but you cannot leave your house without a mask. That kind of a change, that kind of a complete change of the lifestyle, the habits, the customs of the common people, the day-to-day habits, getting transformed, getting changed, is a subsidiary characteristic of this biopolitics, which Foucault was referring to. So the autocracy, the fascist forces, the pandemic dictatorship, with its orders, decrees, the quarantine measures, suspending travels, locking borders, locking streets with steel barricades, forbidding certain activities like opening the liquor shop and other things, hotels, malls, requiring certain other restrictions, the passing of laws in order to ensure that these restrictions are legally and constitutionally followed, and all these things, the state measures to curb the outbreak or on the use of biopower to infringe on personal freedom. So a very good example is the Satankulam lockup death, right? Where the police, in a pandemic situation, the police machinery was given unlimited freedom, freedom, right? Excess liberty, excess powers to infringe upon the personal freedom, to blindly violate the basic human rights, right? All these things, we are mute spectators to all these basic, very, very basic violations, right? Violations of certain basic rights. So there is a follower of Foucault by name Giorgio Agamben, the Italian philosopher. He belongs to the Foucaultian school of thought. He believes that one of the most terrible consequences, I am trying to quote, restate Agamben. He believes, one of the most terrible consequences of a pandemic is the establishment of a state of exception. When the temporarily introduced emergency under the pretext of a virus or other pandemic is extended for an indefinite period, and eventually it becomes an integral part. This is what is going on across the world. We think that these restrictions are temporary. Once COVID-19, once COVID-19 comes to an end, all our quarantine measures, all our wearing mask, all these, virtual classrooms, webinars, all these things will also come to an end, which is a myth again. Now itself, people think that, in the place of a physical workshop, physical webinar, seminar, now we are conducting online virtual seminars, and, in the name of webinars, we are having online lectures, which is very much feasible, which is very much cost effective, which reaches more people. So people already are mulling over the alternatives of having e-classrooms, e-courses, e-degrees, and all other things. So what is temporarily imposed upon an unsuspecting population, an unsuspecting subject, an unsuspecting citizen, is going to be a permanent, integral part of the relationship between the state and the human population. So the constant control over the human subjects, human population, the supervision, the surveillance, all these things will be or are going to be an integral part of the state, integral part of the relationship between the state and the subject, the government and the people. So society, for security reasons, condemns itself to life in an eternal state of fear and insecurity, eventually getting used to it. Initially, many people resisted wearing masks. Many people showed a kind of reservation wearing masks, hesitation to wear masks. Now all of us are used to it, and without wearing a mask, we feel really shy of ourselves. Without wearing a mask, we feel that we miss something in our body. It has become a part of our body. So I used to shake hands, in the past with whoever I encountered when they wish me using folded hands, namaskar or vanakkam. I used to shake hands with them because I can touch them, and that touch, that human touch, is what I always believe in. But then in this corona period, even if somebody proffers the hand to be to shake hands, we are not doing it. Automatically, we wish each other with folded hands. So it becomes an integral part of us, very, very, very unconsciously. So even in the colonial period, you see the colonial government's measures to control the plague included quarantine, isolation camps, trains, especially the plague spread rapidly through trains. So cancellation of trains, quarantine, isolation camps of the laborers, the working class, travel restrictions, and the exclusion of India's traditional medical practices. This is the most important, this is the most important mistake or a deliberate attempt on the part of the colonial government to undermine India's traditional medical practices, especially the tribal medical practices or the indigenous healing methods. Their quarantine measures included the restriction of India's traditional medical practices, which is a deliberate thing, which is an attack on the indigenous healing practices or the indigenous way of living. It's not just the pandemic discourse. It's not just the narrative of an individual as a patient. It extends it and it successfully converts the whole landscape into a pestilence-stricken land. Again, I go back to Oedipus, the king. It is not just Oedipus for his sin, for his consanguinity, right? Okay, we believe in consanguinity in the Indian context as well. When we have marital relationship, when we have endogamous units or endogamous relationship with close blood relations, then there will be biological deformities. We still believe in that kind of consanguinity. So Oedipus Rex was not punished as an individual, or he was not converted into a patient for his consanguinity. Rather, the whole land was converted into a pestilence-stricken land. This is what exactly happens with every pandemic. It's not the individuals who are converted into patients, but the area. The geographical space itself is turned into a very sinful place. How many of us are now pointing out some streets as this street is a quarantine? We don't even call it as a quarantined street. We call it as a Corona street. And in fact, out of this stigma attached to the COVID-19, the famous Irtukadai Alva owner, right? He committed suicide, unable to bear the isolation, unable to bear the lack of concern from on the part of his own friends, family members, and others. And this kind of an anxiety, irrational anxiety disorder, is what is worse than the real physical pandemic disease, the COVID-19 disease. So this specific narrative is very important. When it constructs a narrative, it doesn't talk about individual as a patient, but it rather talks about the whole land, the whole nation, the whole geographical space as a pestilence-stricken land. The plagues, when we deal with plague, the nation is important, the geographical space is earmarked, and the stigma is attached to the whole space, to the whole village, to the whole geographical region, not to individuals as patients. So the plague or the pestilence-stricken landscapes created, again, certain dichotomies, certain binaries, the dialogue or the binary, the clean versus the unclean, nutrition versus malnutrition, tradition versus modernity, rural versus urban, allopathy, modern medicine versus the indigenous medicine, Siddha, the working class. The working class, the unclean labor. See, initially, I would like to highlight the next important point to you, my dear friends. Initially, there was a belief, there was an argument that all these diseases, the communicable diseases, transmittable diseases, the contagious diseases, the pandemic diseases, originated only from the working class. So the working class, were considered as the classes where the laborers were considered as unclean labor. They involved in unclean labor, and they were unclean, and they were used to open defecation. They were eating beef and other stuff, and the source of these diseases were traced back to, perceptively, not scientifically, to the working class. So it was Dr. Ambedkar in the Indian context, and again M.K. Gandhi right? Ambedkar in volume 6 of his, if you want to trace this specific reference, you can go to volume 6 of Ambedkar's writings and speeches. And Gandhi in his autobiography, My Experiments with the Truth, right? These two have worked together, I would say worked together, or put their minds together to dispel this kind of a belief, to dispel this kind of an opinion, to bulldoze this kind of an argument. When there was a complaint, there was a charge against the Dalits of India, the working class of India, that the source of plague happens to be the Harijans colony, the term used by Gandhi to refer to the Dalits, the Harijans. So later, both of them found out that the Harijan colonies or the Dalit colonies are not sources of the contagious diseases. Rather, the sources are the capitalist hoarding houses. The capitalist hoarding houses where rats multiplied, right? And the rats and the bandicoots became a nightmare for all the human population. So the source is not the source is not the working class, but rather the ruling class, right? And the hoarding class. And in the upper class and the upper caste in India, the upper caste, as long as they were using the dry lavatory, the manual scavengers used to collect it and they keep the place clean. And with the advent of the washable toilets, the upper caste people stopped allowing the sweepers to enter their houses and clean their toilets. During these pandemic times, because of the fear of getting the kind of contagion, right? And hence it became the worst, morbid, deplorable place. So the household of these people became a very morbid place, and the working class houses were very, very clean, because the one who cleans the whole nation is capable of cleaning his own house. So and they also followed a kind of food habit. They also followed. They also take food which are very much seasonal. So seasonal fruits, seasonal grains were consumed by the tribals and the natives. Unlike the urban people who take unseasonal things in the name of fast food and other things. So the laws of, moreover, in tribal spaces, in the native spaces, in the rural spaces, the laws of human life is accepted without any fears. Not only that, you find a larger workforce. You would have encountered a very, very, very tragic news, where a doctor who rescued a lot of corona patients who treated a lot of corona patients in his own hospital, got infected with corona, and he passed away. And his body was not allowed. He was not given a decent burial, and his body was thrown, and he encountered his. He was not even given a decent burial by the locals. And the locals were very much afraid of being infected with the coronavirus if they allow the dead body to be buried in the respective funeral ground. So this specific thing you can't find in a rural landscape, because they have a larger workforce to take care of the deceased. If somebody passes away, the whole village will gather and they will manage with the burial and the related rituals. So the autochthonous preventive measures are readily available only in the rural spaces. The urban spaces are not planned in such a way to draw a framework, to implement certain quarantine measures, to have a kind of infrastructure even to tackle this kind of a pandemic situation. This is one reason why the government of India has announced the initial very strict lockdown for 2 weeks. Because people may think that it was not a wise decision stopping people or keeping people indoors for a period of 15 days without any prior announcement, without preparing them to store their food and other things, essentials. Migrant laborers were left very much foodless, were left starving. So that kind of people may think that it is not a wise decision, but for a third world and fourth world nation like India, where you don't have a ready-made, sustainable infrastructure to tackle COVID-19 situation or any other pandemic situation, the government, with the announcement of a lockdown for 15 days, a very strict lockdown for 15 days, actually, very honestly, scientifically, it has used that specific period to convert college hostels into beds, railway carriages into hospitals, to make all makeshift arrangements to tackle the situation which they really never ever anticipated that would become this much alarming. So that specific workforce is not there in the urban space. The autochthonous preventive measures are not readily available in the urban spaces, and even the healing methods are not available in the urban spaces. In rural landscapes, you have this Party Vaityam, the grandma's healing methods. You some way or the other, I won't say it will protect you from COVID-19. I will simply say it will boost your immunity system. And even if you are acquainted with, even if you are infected with any kind of virus, your body will withstand. That specific resistance power is boosted, is supplied by the grandma's healing methods, the orally transmitted, orally transferred healing methods and clinical methods. The oral warnings not to sleep under trees in the night, not to visit a specific place in the night, not to do this. The do's and don'ts, the oral warnings about the do's and don'ts, the oral instructions about do's and don'ts in a rustic atmosphere, the bedtime stories, all these things together have an inbuilt resistance to tackle any kind of pandemic situation which the urban cities really lack. So literatures and orators and their constructed realities save not only individuals but also plants, trees, insects, birds, animals, etc. So the indigenous way of living, the lifestyle of a tribal, the lifestyle of a native person, the lifestyle in the rural atmosphere is something very eco-friendly and non-exploitative, and it has a sustainable environment. It provides a sustainable environment where man can live with very, 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 with complementing each other, with a complementary relationship. He can live very peacefully with plants, trees, insects, animals, birds, etc. So the urban capitalism has completely destroyed and devastated this kind of a sustainable environment guaranteed by the indigenous lifestyle, by the indigenous culture. You see a very good example now. All our masks which you are buying in the shops for 10 rupees, 20 rupees are not actually meant for masks. Even I heard from one mask dealer that the cloths meant for producing the party flags, especially meant for the party conferences, are very much converted into masks recently. And all other bits and pieces of cloths meant for all other things are now converted into masks and sold at price of 10 rupees and 20 rupees. The Dravidian movement, I would like to make a serious mention here. Even the Dravidian movement which ruled our state, Tamil Nadu, the first ever atheist government across the world, the one and only government for the first time which proclaimed that there is no government ascended to power, that specific movement also, it has done tremendous work in Tamil Nadu, and it has catapulted a very backward state into one of the most developed states of India in terms of all parameters. But then they too mistakenly, dwarfed the seemingly superstitious but very meaningful constructive rituals that are done, in the name of deities, rustic deities and rustic gods, security gods. In the name of abolishing superstitions, the Dravidian movement quite unwittingly, mistakenly dwarfed these, superstitious, seemingly superstitious methods and tools and rituals, into insignificance. That is one specific thing we lack today. So there are a lot of literary sources available as responses to this kind of a pandemic situation. And you should know that the whole world, with the first lockdown, India and even in the West, if you collected data from the online portal for buying and selling books, the Amazon-like portals, if you take a data, a huge rise in the publication or sales of pandemic-related books and pandemic-related articles across the world. Even the book by Albert Camus, The Plague, which was very much an earth-breaking, a groundbreaking text during his own times, was not a text. Sometime back, nobody would prefer to read Albert Camus's The Plague, but now thousands and thousands of copies were sold, ever since the lockdown, the pandemic lockdown. So there is a revival of interest in the readers to have a look at what people would have experienced in a similar pandemic situation across the world, especially Oedipus the King, Daniel Defoe, a journal of the plague year, and Edgar Allan Poe's The Mask of the Red Death, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Chaucer, Canterbury Tales was more about the plague, but Chaucer did not make any kind of direct reference to the plague except in one specific place, because he had a different kind of politics during the Black Death, that he was actually trying to construct a parallel power structure, quite opposite to the Roman Catholic regime in the Vatican City. For the Catholics, if it is Rome, the Vatican City, for the Protestants, it should be the Canterbury. So he was involved in the very construction, the archaeology of an alternate city for the Protestants, for the Protestant Christians, the Canterbury. So with that specific thing, I think he never bothered about referring to, or he never bothered about, or he was least bothered about the intensity of the Black Death of his own times. And John Mandel's Station 11 is there. The Andromeda Strain by Michael Crichton, and Bird Box by Josh, Blindness by Josh Saramago, and Giovanni Boccaccio's is the Decameron, a very prominent work. The Italian, writer has narrated the consequences, the impact of the plague very, very brilliantly. And we have a lot of such writers, and the Journal of the Plague Years by Norman Spinyard, The Last Man by Mary Shelley, The Last Town on Earth by Thomas Mullen, and Love in the Time of Cholera by one of my most favorite writers, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and a lot more. The list is endless. So with all these things, literature actually tries to serve as a shock absorber when humanity is in a shock. So it tries to rescue humanity when all of us are suffering from irrational anxiety disorders, when all of us suffer from solitary syndrome, when all of us suffer from uncertainty, when all of us, like the existentialists, when all of us are very much worried about our own existence, when all of us have nightmares instead of dreams, literature comes for our rescue. Even we have Samskara by Yoranandamurti, where you can find references to the pandemic crisis, how human beings behave in times of human, in times of crisis, in times of pandemic crisis. Also, so more such works. The writers who are supposed to be the most conscious part of our social setup, they all tried their level best to restore humanity. They all tried to, they all made attempts to, instill a kind of endurance and confidence in humanity. So when we are let down, literature comes for our rescue. This is where Jean-Paul Sartre says, all writing is political, and a writer should have a political purpose, have a commitment. A writer should have a commitment to the society in which he is an articulate part. So the writers try to respond very emotionally, psychologically, scientifically, historically, and more humanly to the pandemic crisis across the world. And in times to come, we will sure, we'll be getting a lot of literary responses to the pandemic situation. Now, day in and day out, you are very much familiar with the help of social networking platforms. Every individual is writing something. They either they write poems, or they write some kind of short novellas. Sometimes they write some short piece of anecdotes, some real life incidents, and they all write something and they float it in their Facebook pages and other things. And there are competitions across the world for writing pandemic poems, and the publishing houses will also be there is a politics, with the publishing houses as well. The publishing houses are now, after publishing all kinds of pandemic related discourses and pandemic related fictional works. So literature as always serves a kind of serves the role of the savior, right? Serves the role of humanizing us, right, human beings. And when we lack empathy, it comes to educate us. When we lack fellow feeling, it comes to educate us. And its role is not just to entertain, but also to teach us what it means to be a human being, especially in times of crisis. So with these words, let me highlight the points which I have already given you in three important statements. My statement number one is there is a possibility, or it is very much unavoidable and imminent that with the rise of this pandemic protective measures, parallelly, there is a rise of the neo-dictatorship as well. And secondly, the choice of the government to protect people and to let some groups of people to die, that is another important thing that we literary scholars and literature students should keep in mind. It's after all the human being who is an individual, who is much more important than a society which is a kind of cardboard society, cardboard humanity. We don't require. We require a humanity with flesh and blood. So our concern, when we lack concern for our family members, when we lack concern for the society, literature comes and it instills a kind of confidence, concern, and fellow human feeling. So with these words, I would like to wind up my lecture session. If there are any questions related to the pandemic discourse and literary responses, I'm happy to respond to such queries. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, sir, for your informative and enlightening session, and throwing light on the current issues, which is current situation, which is engulfed by COVID-19, and which has impact on the plant and animal kingdom too. Thank you for a wonderful presentation, and you have received many positive comments, and the participants have given very good comments about your presentation. Thank you so much, sir. And now I request the participants to post their queries and questions in the chat box. And I invite Ms. Kalaivani, Assistant Professor of English, to moderate the session. She will read the questions and queries to you, sir. Ms. Kalaivani.
Kalaivani ma'am, are you there?
Yeah, ma'am.
Ma'am, you can read out the questions to sir, ma'am.
Okay, sir, it's from Professor Sharon. Is the suicide spike, which is accounted to depression during this lockdown period, is as a result of people's belief in so-called myths associated with the plagues?
Pardon, can you repeat the question?
Is the suicide spike, which is accounted to depression during this lockdown period, is as a result of people's belief in so-called myths associated with the plagues?
This is an interesting question. I would like to respond to this question by drawing examples from literary sources and also myths. We associate or we relate this specific COVID-19 situation or the corona outbreak only in terms of our, the previous experiences of humanity, human experiences, right? In the pandemic, period. So in the earlier times, in the previous pandemic crisis, how people responded to what kind of experiences they encountered, they faced, right? With that only we construct our own, or we make our perceived ideas about, we construct our perceived ideas about the present pandemic only by relating this with the earlier pandemics. And earlier pandemics reaches not only through words, but also through visual images. A lot of apocalyptic films we would have watched, a lot of apocalyptic and dystopic science fictional movies and works we would have read and watched. So such movies, such literary works were not actually based on purely on medical grounds, medical history, but also with a kind of superstitious beliefs held by people who lived in that specific period of time. That is why I gave you an example, how certain ghost movies, right, where some people, I can give you a local example. There is a film called Seventh Sense, Elam Arivu, where all people, die instantly, and they all die very much instantly because of a very strange disease, a kind of bizarre disease, a kind of bizarre anxiety was created, by a very strange disease, which is very much a miasmic disease.
Excuse me, sir. Sir, I have a question that in the beginning you had talked about some miasmic discourse, something like that.
Yes.
Could you please elaborate on that?
Sure.
Thank you.
Just a minute. It is miasma, the miasmic disorder. Miasma is a Greek, it's a term which has a Greek origin, Miasma means any kind of disease that spreads through air, the pestilence in the air. The air as contaminated, and airborne diseases, the contagious diseases, most of them are airborne diseases. Quite recently, a couple of days back, more than 80 scientists across Europe, they represented to the United Nations that COVID-19 is also an airborne disease. It is not only a viral disease, it is a miasmic disease as well. It does not spread only through human contact, but also through air. When somebody sneezes, when somebody coughs, the virus transmits itself through air to the neighboring person as well, for which, wearing a very, very well-designed mask is advisable. So this specific miasmic disorder, the term miasma was very much referred to by the Greek, medical historians, medical anthropologists, and also by the playwrights, the Greek playwrights like Sophocles and Aeschylus and all these playwrights. They used this specific term miasma, all over their writings. So miasma simply means a pestilence in the air, any airborne disease. When the atmosphere is very much polluted and when a disease spreads so rapidly through air, that specific situation is referred to as a miasmic disturbance, a miasmic crisis.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. There's one more question from Ms. Ranjana. How far will the reality of today be reflected in the post-COVID literature, which would be the preferred vehicle for writers in future?
As I already told you, now itself people started writing about the COVID experiences, the corona experiences or experiences related to COVID-19 situation. But many writings that appear in social networking sites or appear in newspapers as such are not having any kind of historical connectivity with the past pandemic literatures. The present the present writings are the writers today, or readers who took the role of a writer today with thanks to the social networking sites. Readers who got transformed into writers and write poems, write certain anecdotes and real life incidents in their own Facebook pages and other platforms. They all either narrate the problems associated with pandemic, external, the migrant crisis and all such things in a very, very outward manner, because literature I believe should discuss certain things in a metaphorical, in a very symbolic manner, like Albert Camus having written The Plague. It's not just about the plague, but it also takes a metaphorically it also implies the rise of dictatorship of Hitler. So in a way, literature should be indirect. Literature should take a metaphorical theme, or it should reflect the reality in a metaphorical or symbolic manner, rather than becoming newspeak. Because I always believe that history is doing the role of chronicling the events, and literature gives a human dimension to it by picking up more intimate human experiences and weaving the same kind of tale. So writers in post COVID-19 situation will be loaded with a lot of themes associated with the pandemic situation, like the migrant crisis, the rise in the domestic violence across the world, and all violence against children, right, in this lockdown period. All such things become sources for many writers who take up writing in the post COVID-19 situation.
Thank you, sir. There's one more from Professor Mary Manonmani. When students corrected by teachers Parents, society blame teachers of using excessive force. What do you think about it, sir?
This question has no relevance to the topic pandemic literature. I think she's trying to ask the question in a different manner. I understand the question in the context of the introduction of online classrooms for school children and even some college students, and where teachers are giving their lectures through an online platform. There are two different ways of interpreting this introduction of online classes. On one hand, it is quite unavoidable that it has become a part of, as I already told you, it has become an integral part of our life thanks to COVID-19 situation. People who were very much allergic to online platforms were compelled to use online platforms as there is no hope or nobody knows when COVID-19 will ease. So this kind of a thing has compelled us to go for this kind of a platform. Number two, there is a darker side to the online platforms. In the phase of conducting online exams, MCQ tests, and all such things, submitting assignments or evaluating scripts online. In all these things, there is an injustice done to the rural students who do not have multiple devices at home. So a person with multiple devices can easily browse the web and find answers and readily supply answers, and they can without any interruption, with uninterrupted network connectivity and high bandwidth, they can listen to the lectures online. But poor rural area students with a single device or with no device are denied of this kind of an opportunity, which needs to be taken into serious consideration.
Thank you, sir. Do you believe that all these things are going to be truly reflected in the post-pandemic literary discourses?
Not exactly, because we human beings are not that much, time conscious, I would say. Since we are directly becoming victims either of the disease or of the steps taken by the government, we keep talking about it. Once the pandemic comes to an end, we easily forget, we tend to forget these things, the migrant labor crisis and whatever problems the whole world faced, the joblessness of youngsters, all these things we tend to forget with the erasure of this virus from our society. But then my warning to my dear friends and academicians across is, with this temporarily accepted powers of the state, there is a possibility of that temporarily introduced, quarantine measures or whatever measures you talk about, that are certain schemes and the patrolling and the surveillance mechanisms, that might become very much permanent structures of the neo-dictatorship societies.
Thank you, sir. Is there any link between the responses in literature about the pandemic and those things happening in real life?
Naturally, literature is nothing but a medium. The society wants to articulate the most, the most intense forms of human experiences in literature. Literature cannot be produced in a vacuum. Whatever is happening to us today will be the subject matter, will be the content for tomorrow's literature. It cannot escape the reality and the consequences of COVID-19. Even the publishing houses have dismissed many of its employees, citing reasons of the poor circulation of their newspapers, poor circulation of print sources. Many publishing houses are turning online to online mode with the rise of pandemic, and then it has its adverse impact on millions and millions of people.
Thank you, sir. There's a question from Anjan Saikia. Will people's present blind acceptance of government norms in the name of pandemic result in permanent threat in future, which would eventually push them into inevitable resistance and power tussle.
This is what I highlighted. Throughout my lecture, I kept warning. I kept issuing a warning to all dear participants about this specific thing only. So what we perceive today as a temporarily introduced power structure is going to be a permanent power structure, and I am really afraid whether we can resist that specific power accumulated structure, because when democracy is cancelled and autocracy replaces it, citing pandemic as a reason, because we people now, whatever the government passes in the name of order, we are supposed to follow it, because all of us believe that the government is there only to do things only in the interests of the public. So whatever the government asks us, we are all law-abiding citizens, and we oblige the government very, very, very loyally and very strictly. But then this kind of a thing can be converted into a permanent power structure, and it can tend to become a very dictatorial kind of regime in future as well. We should be well informed about this specific transition. That is where I'm coming.
Thank you, sir. Does literature amidst pandemic really provoke the literary lovers and literary students to gain knowledge and improve themselves to overcome isolation?
That is the intention of literature, if not the writer. But then I don't really. Yeah. I don't really think. Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
I don't really think literature would motivate or inspire people to overcome this kind of a thing, because all of us are really very much suffering from a kind of alienation. The sense of alienation is there, but then this comes as a rescue force. This comes as a relief for us. But the intention of such literatures, the intention of literature itself is to rescue humanity whenever it faces a crisis. In that way, I believe literature should be a source of inspiration for readers. But then at times, with the habit of reading, being replaced by browsing and involving in the social network sites, I think the role of literature is also getting transformed from its traditional conservative modes to the modern and postmodern and post-truth modes. So it should alleviate our sufferings to some extent, at least.
Pandemic situation changed the normal life of people in India. What will be the impact of this change in the near future?
Future, I'm sorry to say this, the future is going to be very, very bleak, because more and more people will be left unemployed. The economic reality, the economic structures have gone down all over the world, and even in developed nations, the economy has gone down, and the economy has faced a serious blow. In a nation like India, which is a third world country and a developing nation, the economy has gone very much down, and it has its own subsidiary problems like loss of jobs, rehabilitation of the migrant laborers in their respective spaces. Thousands and thousands of people have already migrated from Chennai, the hub of employment opportunities, to their respective, regions, to their respective villages. So they have to rehabilitate themselves. So all these rehabilitation measures, the countering the problem of joblessness and unemployment, these problems, and in addition to a lot more problems, are to be tackled by the government and also by the people. Whatever crisis follows the COVID-19 situation is going to hit all of us very badly.
Thank you, sir. I hope we have seen all the questions so far. Yes. Is there any other question? If you have any other queries, please do unmute yourself and pose the question to the professor himself. Someone, Mr. Abdul Hazam, has posted in the chat box asking, do you think Corona is more a drama than a reality?
It is, I won't say, because, he has used the word drama, but I don't want to use the word drama, but yes, it is a reality, but that social reality, that medical reality is offered to us in a with a lot of imagination attached to that, with a lot of perceptual data attached to that. It is reaching us in a different form. In that way, yes, Corona looks like a creature which appears in a movie, and the whole incidents that are associated with it or attached to Corona, look very much cinematic than realistic. But then, if we look into the real lives, then we can understand the pangs, the angst of the real working class and the real labor population of India.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. Hello.
Hello, ma'am. Hello, ma'am. Ms. Swati, please do ask your question to Professor, ma'am.
I am audible, ma'am.
Yes, you are audible, ma'am.
First of all, I thank you, sir, for this informative session. I am so much enhanced my knowledge through this session. My question is that, sir, how can we relate this pandemic to the reference of the work Women and the Plague in Year of Wonders that came in 2001? And what's the effect of this on this literature perspective, mainly in the culture studies perspective? How can we relate it through this work?
No, not only this specific work.
But I read the work of Albert Camus, The Plague. I also, but in this work there are lots of reference of the nurses and the keepers and the whole situation where lies in the context of women. So how can we relate it? Because in that time, the 14th century, there is a myth that the woman is the main source of this thing or the kind of thing. So what can we relate this thing?
Yeah. Let me answer the question.
Yes, sir.
This specific branding of or tracing the source of a pandemic disease to the other within quotes. It has been there in many systems. It has been there in many traditional conservative societies. Even in the Tamil context, even in many other regional contexts of India. The blame game. Instead of geographically blaming somebody, it is bodily or physically, biologically blaming the other sex as the source of the source of disease or the source of the evil or source of the miasma or this disorder. It has been there, but then I would like to highlight one more thing, which stands quite in stark contrast to this specific complaint or this specific accusation against the other. In most tribal societies, in most rustic societies, it is the women who resisted this kind of thing. The preparedness with which they faced and encountered the pandemic disease, even in movements, even in civil society groups, in civil society groups and movements, championing the cause of ecological movements across the world, women took prominent pivotal role in protecting the atmosphere and the ecological setup. In fact, they help the natural setup sustainable. So this is the fact. On the other hand, which has been distorted, possibly because the system was very much patriarchal and phallocentric. They blamed women for the source of the diseases. Yes.
Yeah. So, what is the effect of this pandemic in the social culture studies context, mainly in the mass media and the film media? There's lots of sections in the culture study. Or nowadays, culture studies are the more important topic, and in our course, it also be involved. So, how its effect on that kind of thing? This pandemic. What's the future of the culture studies in relate to that pandemic?
Well, I already highlighted in my lecture. During
Yes,
my
sir.
lecture, I was talking about the culture of the indigenous people. So the culture of the indigenous people, the culture of the rural spaces, or the rural culture, right? The native culture it has come into serious, attack, and all those cultural traits and characteristics are seriously, bulldozed, distorted, destroyed by the urban culture, the neoliberal, the neo-globalization.
Yes, yes, sir. And the colonization.
These neo-colonial globalization, right? The globalized world,
And the personal perspective, yeah.
right? These things have done enough damage to the native cultures and the culture, which guarantees a kind of very, very, very sustainable environment. So in that aspect, cultural studies can discuss the pandemic situation as another important threat to native cultures and indigenous methods, indigenous healing methods, and indigenous ways to encounter the pandemic crisis.
Yes, yeah. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank
It did a very interesting session, and the Q&A session was also very interesting. Over to Professor Sumati.
Thank you, sir. And you have cleared all the doubts, and you gave a very lucid and apt answers to all the questions raised by the participants. Thank you so much. May I call upon Ms. Sharon, Assistant Professor of English, to propose vote of thanks. Sharon?
Warm greetings to one and all. Gratitude is the sign of noble souls and most powerful emotion that humans can show for each other. Hence, as we now battle against the tough times during this pandemic, let us not forget to be grateful for the ample opportunities provided to us to widen our knowledge through various platforms. On behalf of the PG and Research Department of English, St.Mary's College, I take great pleasure in extending my heartfelt gratitude to the resource person of the day, Dr. T.Marx, Professor, Department of English, Pondicherry University. Thank you very much, sir, for kindly consenting to share with us your insightful thoughts on this very interesting topic. It is to be admitted that a global contagion deserves a global perspectives. In this view, the webinar on pandemic discourse and literary responses has undoubtedly brought to light the historical, social, political, and religious dimensions of pandemics that have affected people in the world history.
Thank you, sir, for helping us to reflect on the ancestral fear of humans toward infectious diseases and literary responses which play an influential role in changing the perspectives of the global public. As you mentioned, literature unquestionably serves as a savior and shock absorber to mitigate the shock and trauma infused by the pandemic. Their address perhaps remain even more fascinating to us as you explain the myths associated with these plagues and the way minds of the public is psychologically tuned to these myths. So we express a profound sense of gratitude to you for sparing your precious time with us amidst your very busy schedule. I place on record my sincere thanks to our Secretary, our Principal, and the other members of the administration for constantly motivating us to strive for the best. Many thanks are due to the convener of the webinar, Ms. Judith Sheila Damayanti, Associate Professor of English, for coordinating the progress of this webinar. I wholeheartedly thank the faculty members of the Department of English for their sincere efforts to ensure smooth conduct of the webinar. I take this opportunity to acknowledge the presence of the staff members from other institutions within and outside of Tamil Nadu for their overwhelming response. Your participation, although virtual, is a great delight to all of us. We sincerely appreciate the enthusiasm with which you all responded to our invitation. Most of all, I thankfully remember the endless grace of the providence and the Lord's abiding presence in all our endeavors. Once again, I thank you one and all. Let us all stay home, stay safe, and continue to nourish your knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, participants. We have few last minute announcements. The feedback link is posted in the chat box of the Google Meet and in the live chat box of the YouTube live streaming also. So kindly make sure you provide complete correct details in the chat box in the Google Forms, because if you make mistakes, it is an auto generated certificate. We find difficulties in dispatching the certificates to your registered mail IDs. So please make sure that you provide exact correct details in the feedback form for dispersing your certificates without any errors. The certificates will be dispatched to you in 10 working days, because we are working on the certificates and we'll be sending you individually. So it will take time. So please patiently wait for 10 days, and within 10 days all your certificates will be sent to your registered mail IDs. Thank you all. We will meet you again in another webinar very soon. Thank you all for your patient listening and your participation. The chat box and the Google Meet and live stream will be open for few more minutes. You can copy your feedback link and you can submit your feedback there in the feedback link.
Hello.
Yes, yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Patricia, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Like,
Ma'am, am I
ah,
audible?
ah, ah. Yes, 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 yeah. Okay. Hello.
Yes, ma'am. Any clarifications?
After the meeting, I'll call you.
Okay, okay, okay.
Okay, okay.